Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, finally. I was worried for a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for having me on this event. Really excited to share with you some of the latest developments in the DevOps space. So hopefully it will be an interesting and useful session for you. Feel free to ask questions along the way. I think let's try and make this as interactive and as beneficial for you as possible. Hopefully you can see my screen as well. So today I'm going to be talking about the latest features of the ALM and DevOps that apply to the Power Platform. But before I start, I just wanted to share with you some useful information about me. So thank you for the intro earlier. So the only thing I would like to add is that on the screen you can see some of my contact information. So in case you want to reach out to me after the session, if you have any specific queries, feel free to do that. I'll also paste some of these in the chat in case it's easier for you to access. And finally, I've also launched a YouTube channel actually earlier in the year. There's not a lot of content on it yet, but hopefully we'll add some more content in there. But if you're starting with DevOps on the Power Platform, there is one introduction video on there at the moment. So I think that can be quite useful if you're just starting up in that space. So without further delays, let's continue into the session. Okay. So before I talk about the latest features, I just want to briefly touch upon what is DevOps, because I think I just want to introduce that concept just to make sure that the rest of the presentation will flow from here. So DevOps is, think about it as, the number of activities that need to happen from the time when we have a requirement from the customer or stakeholder until we get that requirement into our production environment and the users are able to access that. So there is a number of things that happen. So one of them is planning the requirements and prioritization, and I think it's important to get the requirements right, because if we don't get the requirements, no matter how efficient we are in the next stages, we're not going to deliver what the customer has asked for. And then we move into the development phase. So this is where we kind of configure the Power Platform or potentially write some custom code as well. And the idea in DevOps is sometimes you may end up with peer reviews. So if you have a large team working on things, you may, if a developer or a customizer finishes something, you may want to get that reviewed by someone else before that gets kind of committed and pushed further into the test environments. And then we have something called the CI build. So this is the process that takes everything from our environments and source control, or one or the other, it depends on the scenario, and then generates the packages that are needed to deploy that into the test environment, for example. And as part of the CI process, it's called CI because it's continuous integration. So we're integrating all the changes for multiple people on the team. And then we run some checks as part of that as well to make sure that, the changes are actually working together. And after that, we may provision a number of environments for testing purposes. We may back up the environment before we do deployment. So there is some level of environment management involved. And then we end up doing the deployment, starting with a test environment, but then we follow the same process to deploy that same change into, for example, UAT and production. So typically in the Power Platform, it's mainly importing solutions, but there may be some additional extra steps that we need to do that we can't do in solutions, and some other tests that we run just to make sure that everything is working on top of that. And finally, we deploy that into production. Production in a lot of cases is slightly different than the other environments because there may be some change control processes, approvals, some different stakeholders may need to get involved. So, in a DevOps point of view, there is sometimes some special steps that you have to do in production. And then once we deploy, we monitor, we see how things are working, and we also gather feedback from the users and from the team, and then we feed that back into planning again, and the cycle continues. The most important thing in DevOps is, when we go through all these stages, it has to be as quick as possible. So we're not talking about deploying things every 6 months, for example. We need to have the ability to deploy, for example, every week if we need to, or even more frequently or less frequently. So to be able to achieve that, we need to have automation because otherwise we can't move that quickly across all these stages. So this requires, for example, build automation, deployment automation, potentially testing automation, and it depends on the complexity, on the maturity of the project. You may decide to adopt more or less of these different concepts. So that's a quick intro. So how does this apply into the Power Platform? So in the Power Platform, I think there is an increasing different scenarios that we can use with the Power Platform. So there are the types of complex projects where we have CDS, we have the potentially plugins, source code, potentially some Azure components, and we tend to have very kind of technical developers on these projects. But we also have some other projects where maybe just a Canvas app or a number of flows, and sometimes these two can obviously coexist, but sometimes it's maybe a simple project or a very complex project. So the idea is to have a DevOps process that kind of works for both of these scenarios. And the DevOps process that I'm going to be referring to today work within the CDS environment because most of the ALM capabilities within the Power Platform work based on the CDS environment today. So even if you just have light customizations, even if you just have a project that you configure, within a week, the DevOps that I will be showing today still utilizes the Power Platform and the CDS environments. So the idea in DevOps as well is sometimes if it's a very simple project, we may just export a solution, for example, from a dev environment and import it into the test environment without even needing source control. And there is an increasing probably number of capabilities that you may not even have multiple environments. Maybe you just have a single environment that you kind of work in for very kind of localized cases. But anything beyond that, you need to follow proper ALM best practices. And to do that, we have to use source control. So source control should be our master. So we should be able to really regenerate, all our kind of customizations and all our source code and deployment scripts and everything from version control. So typically in the Power Platform, we have customizers working in the CDS environment, and they make the changes in there. And then we have the developers working in, potentially in the CDS environment as well, but also in, things like VS Code or Visual Studio. So they can do things like, plugins, web resources, custom controls, etc. So at some point when the developers are happy with their changes, in the Visual Studio, they tend to compile them or package them and then deploy them into the CDS environment, and they test the changes in the CDS environment. And once everything is working, they tend to commit these source files into source control. So the only thing that is missing still is the configuration changes that are still sitting in the CDS environment. So to be able to get these into source control, we need to come up with a process that then takes them from the CDS environments and puts them into version control. And to do that, what we normally do is export the changes as a solution, and then we run a tool. You can do this using a number of ways, but the core tool that does it is called the solution packager. So basically it extracts the changes from a zip and then puts them in a format that is more compatible with version control. And then once we have all these individual files, then we push them into version control as well. So that process in the red box could be automated, could be done manually by the developer, could be triggered by the customizer. So there is a number of ways to achieve that, and we probably expect this to become easier and easier going forward and more intuitive. But the end goal is to have everything in source control, and once we have everything in source control, then we can use source control to regenerate the solutions and any other things that we need, and then deploy it into a number of environments. And I'll show you how some of that may work in some of the demos later on as well. So I think we've got a good hopefully understanding of the theory and how things work. So I just wanted to kind of move on to talk about some of the tools that are available to make a lot of these things happen. So one of the tools that you're probably aware of is the Power Platform build tools. So that works so that is an extension basically for Azure DevOps. So if you are using Azure DevOps, this is very useful. So it's been released as a preview earlier last year, but there is a new version now called the Power Platform build tools released earlier this year. So that supports obviously the PowerApps. It's published by Microsoft, and it contains a number of key tasks that are useful for automating a lot of the things that I shared with you. So you can, for example, export solutions, import solutions. You can manage these in source control using the pack and unpack tasks. You can, for example, use the package deployer to import potentially a number of different solutions and some data and some additional steps. And you can also run some checks and additional environment changes. So overall, it's a very useful tool, and there is more changes that are likely to come in and additional capabilities in there. So the next tool that I wanted to introduce you to as well, in case you're not aware of, is the Power DevOps tools. So that tool has been available since earlier in 2017. It does support, the latest version of Power Platform, but it also supports some of the earlier on-premise versions as well, in case you have some of these on-premise projects as well. So it's free, open source on GitHub, so you can look at the source, you can contribute, you can raise issues on there, and it contains, almost 47 different tasks. So I'm not going to cover some of the things that the Power Platform build tools does as well, but I just wanted to highlight some of the additional things that it does at the moment, in case you are facing some of these scenarios or challenges in your projects and you want to kind of extend your pipelines more. So we have the apply upgrade. So as you know, when you import solutions, you can either import the solution in the normal mode, or you can import it with an upgrade, which means you kind of create the solution on the side, which allows you to delete, for example, unused attributes. So it does support that as well in 2 stages. So you can do the first stage, you can have some work, and then you can apply the second stage. We have the solution checker as well. So that's split into 2 tasks, one of them that does the scan, and the other one that can fail the build based on the results of the scan. It contains a number of additional options. So you can, for example, filter out files that you don't need, or you can execute specific rule sets. In terms of environments management, it allows you to set the instance into an admin mode. So if you're doing a release, for example, and you don't want anyone to log in, you can use the pipeline to set the instance in admin mode, and then you can take that off after. There are a number of utilities around plugins and web resources in case you want to push these from version control into a build environment, for example. Lots of capabilities around solutions, whether you want to create a solution, clone, patch, all this kind of stuff is there. One of the important features is the reference data. So this is the configuration migration utility. So it contains tasks that allows you to export the data from a dev environment and check it into source control, but also take it from source control and then import it into a specific environment. And finally, there is some new features around environment variables. So if you're using environment variables in your solutions and you want to set these during deployment, or you want to configure your service endpoints for the service bus or webhooks, because there will be different connections per environment. Again, you can use the Power DevOps tool to configure all of these in the pipelines. So that's the Power DevOps tools. So I'm going to move into GitHub Actions. Any questions so far? Okay, let's continue. So GitHub Actions is the latest addition into the tool sets. So the first 2 extensions work very well with Azure DevOps. So GitHub Actions works for GitHub. So you can use the latest GitHub Actions to work with the Power Platform. So this is in preview, very, very new. Again, it supports the same things as the previous ones. It's released by Microsoft, and it's currently got 7 actions. So these are the key actions that you can use to get started if you're using, for example, GitHub. So you can export, import, manage source control. There is a few new tasks like branch and clone, which I'll show you later. They are quite useful. And obviously it's in the preview, so there is a lot more things that will probably come in into this tool set as well. It is open source as well on GitHub, so you can see the source in there. So GitHub Actions, just a brief intro into GitHub Actions. So GitHub has the concept of jobs. So in Azure DevOps, we have builds, releases, and we have pipelines. In GitHub Actions, we have jobs. So it's a very flexible way of organizing things, because you could execute a job on any event. So the other thing that we have is events. So an event could be somebody commits code, somebody changes a status of an issue, or somebody kind of creates a release. So the number of events are, there's lots of events basically that you can use to trigger your jobs, which gives you a lot more flexibility and allows you to do probably some of the scenarios that you couldn't do maybe in Azure DevOps. So we have the events, we have the jobs. Basically, the job contains a number of different steps, and the actions basically for the Power Platform is one of these steps. So for example, you could have a job that exports a solution. So step 1 could be publish customization, step 2 could be export, and then step 3 could be, for example, publish an artifact. And then these jobs have to execute on a runner. So runner is where the actual job executes. So you have some provided runners by GitHub, but if you wanted to run, for example, on your own infrastructure, for example, in Azure or on-prem, you could do that as well. So I've already mentioned some of these things, and obviously GitHub Actions are on the GitHub page, so you can interact with them, and you can raise issues, etc. You can see what they are doing, and the runners actually support a number of different technologies. So in case you have multiple technologies in the projects, you can automate your scenarios end to end as well. So before I move on to the PowerShell tools, I just wanted to jump into demo mode for a bit and take a break from the slides. So let's take a look. Any questions so far? Okay. So so the first tool is the Power DevOps tools. So again, these are in the marketplace. You can see what they do. This is the Power Platform build tools. So I have a sample solution here, XRM CI sample. It contains a number of entities, some flows and plugins, and all the kind of things that you would typically use in a project. So just to give you an example, for example, of the Power Platform build tools.
We are seeing your PPT actually, so we are not seeing it. Are you sharing any other screen with?
I am, sorry. I probably shared the PPT in the beginning. Let me share the screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. Hopefully, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, now we are able to see your screen well.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So I think just to recap for quick, so the Power DevOps tools and the Power Platform build tools, obviously you can download from the marketplace, and you can see, all the documentation in terms of what they do and the release notes. So today I have a sample solution, XRM CI sample, so it contains a number of customizations. So let's take a look at how, for example, the Power Platform build tools work. So we have a simple pipeline here that illustrates how these tools can work. So So in this scenario, we're exporting a solution, but before we export, we want to set the version. So the first thing you have to do in the Power Platform build tools is add the tool installer task. So that basically, tells the pipeline that we need a certain number of tools to be able to run this. So please download the tools. Next step is you set the version, so you can specify your environment. You can use a username and password, or you can use a service principal, which is recommended now because of the MFA. So you specify the solution name, the version, and then you export. Similar scenario, you pick your environment, and then you specify the solution name that you want to export, and then you specify where you want it to get exported into, and then you publish that solution as an artifact, which you can use for deployment. So if we go, for example, to one of the executions.
Next month, I'm probably going to do a presentation.
Sorry, can you go on mute if you're unmuted? Because we can hear some noise. Okay. So this is one of the executions. So you can see clearly that you get full audit of what's happening and what's getting deployed and exported in this case. You can also see that this build publishes a number of solutions. So in this case, it's exporting the solution, and you can use that solution then during another pipeline to import into another environment. So this is kind of exporting from one environment and then making that solution available for import. I have another build here which does something slightly different, and this is using the Power DevOps tools. So this one is using version control. So we have a number of plugins in version control, and we have some customizations. So we have to build the plugins. We run our unit tests. Again, we need to use the tool installer to download all the tools, and you can see you have some flexibility in terms of which versions you may want to use if you want to, for example, downgrade or upgrade the out-of-the-box versions. We set the version in source control. We pack the solution from source control. Again, we can provide a mapping file. So this tells the solution packager to pick up the plugins from version control. Well, not from version control, actually from the build, from the plugins that we compile instead of from version controls, because we don't normally want to check in DLLs into the version control. Then we run the PowerApps checker. So again, we provide the solution that we want to execute the PowerApps checker. Again, some parameters in here, and this is where I was referring to. You can exclude files and you can override the rules, etc. And then we have another task which you can use to fail the build if, for example, you don't like the results from the PowerApps checker. For example, if you have too many high issues, you may want to fail the build and get the team to fix the issues. And then we can, I think this is just a different way of packaging the task, but basically we publish the artifacts in the end. So if we have a look at the execution of this build, for example, we get the same artifacts as before. We get some code analysis from the PowerApps checker as well in there. So if you can see we have some unit tests as well executing, because now we have plugins. We can see the scans. So this is the PowerApps checker results. We can see them on the build here to see, for example, someone's created a plugin that retrieves all columns, which is not recommended. So that kind of gives us a good indication of whether this solution is ready to go forward using a release or not. So in terms of release pipelines, so again, similar situation. You basically have the builds on your left, and then you have the environments on the right. So in this case, we're consuming a build, two builds. So and then we define the steps. So let me just show you what the steps do. So let's edit the tasks. So you can see there's lots of steps in here which you may or may not need, but just to give you an idea, for example, we set the environment to the admin mode at the start. We take that off at the end. We do a backup of the environment. We import the solution. We configure some of the service endpoints to point to a different Azure function. We import some of the reference data using the configuration migration task. We execute some of the custom steps using the package deployer task. We have some reference data as well that we can update, for example. So this is the equivalent of what you would do with environment variables in the old days, because you couldn't use environment variables, so you'd have a custom entity with a key value pair. So you can set these using the pipeline. But if you're using environment variables, again, for example, in this case, I'm saying that this value of the environment variable should be set to production because this is the production environment. And I want to set this value to a dynamic value as well. So at the time of the deployment, you can change these values in your environment. Another example is the plugin secure configuration. So you may have some secrets that are different between environments, so you can set these in here. And then we have some tests running in the end of the pipeline. So fairly comprehensive pipeline from a deployment point of view. So let's just cancel out of that, and then you can see obviously all the different steps executing. You can add approvals as well before that if you want. So that's Azure DevOps. I'm going to move into GitHub Actions. Any questions on Azure DevOps before I move on?
Well, I think Bilal is having one question. So Bilal, you can unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Here, hello, Wael. I saw
Sure.
one step extra which is not belongs to Power your add-on. VS test UI automation test. For what purpose you did this? Because all other steps are belongs to package.
Mm-hmm.
Check replace down it VS Visual Studio test. Why that?
This one?
is?
This one?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so this one is actually executing some of the automated tests on the environment. So there is two types of tests in this case. One of them is that executes some of the API tests. So this is, for example, calling the CDS API to create a contact and then checking whether some of the plugins and other things triggered. And then we have the UI tests, which is using the PowerApps automation framework. To start the UI app and then execute a number of scenarios, and then it's just to make sure that the deployment works. So if we look at the sorry, let's go back into the tasks. Yeah, so this is basically so this is just triggering some of the triggering basically some of the tests in the. So there is a filter here to test the integration test, and there is another filter here to do the UI automation tests. And these tests are actually on GitHub. So there's a sample in here. So if you go into the sample, you can see there is the integration tests and the UI tests. So this is just executing the tests as part of the pipeline using the out-of-the-box VS test execution tasks. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Yeah, I got you. Just I didn't found that in before versions, so that's why I asked that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. Okay, so let's move on to GitHub Actions. Sorry.
Well, there is one request from Faisal.
Yeah.
To zoom your computer display. I think the people are not able to see the computer display. Can you zoom a little bit?
Yeah, I can zoom.
I mean only the browser.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay,
Thanks,
perfect.
yeah.
Thank you for the feedback. Hopefully you can see better now. Okay, so let's move on to the GitHub. So before we do that, I'm gonna come into one of the solutions in here. So this is the solution that we've been working through. So I'm going to add a new attribute to the solution. So the scenario we are going to play here is that we have a citizen developer making some changes. So creating a new attribute, and then we're gonna try and push the attribute into version control, and then generate a solution out of that. So I'm just gonna save this entity, and then once that entity is saved, I'm just going to publish the customizations, and we're gonna do this using GitHub Actions. So I'll let this publish. So GitHub Actions are, as I mentioned before, they're open source, so you can see the actions actually in here. So you can feel free to take a look. There's also another link which has the lab for the Power Platform actions. So this is a sample of how you could use the actions, and there's some documentation in here. So in case you're not familiar with the actions, it's a good place to start. So today I'm going to be giving you a demo of a slightly tweaked version of the lab, basically. So on here I'm using this project. It's on GitHub as well. This is feel free to come and have a look. So we have a folder for our solution. This is where I keep the customizations. So for example, I have the contact entity. So if I make a change to one of the attributes, for example, I'm expecting some changes in this folder. So to do that, I'm gonna go into the actions, and I have two actions at the moment, or two jobs. So one of them is going to create a pull request based on the changes that we've done in the CDS environment, and the other one is basically going to take the changes from version control and then create a solution out of that. So let's start the first one. So all I have to do is execute it. You can set up an automated trigger for that, but at the moment it's a manual execution. So we have this job executing. It's running on the default agent. So while this is executing, I'm just going to show you what is involved in getting this set up. So you just give it a name, and then you decide on the event. So in this case, it's a manual trigger, but you can add a number of events on here. And then you have the job. You call the job another name. So you give it a name. So you have the workflow name, you have the job name. You specify where it needs to run under, in this case, Windows, and then you have the steps. So in this case, I'm just executing some steps to increase to change some of the Git configuration to allow me to check in long path. Again, checkout action is fairly standard. So this is all fairly standard. So this is where the Power Platform comes in. So the first thing you have to do is basically, let me zoom in a little bit more maybe on this one. So when you need to use a GitHub action, you have to specify where it comes from. In this case, you're just referring to another Git repo. So in this case, I want to use the whoami action. So this is connecting to the environment. So you specify the environment, URL, the username, and the secret. And you define your secrets in GitHub as well. So there's a section called secrets in your settings. So you can specify, the different credentials that you can use in your pipelines. In this case, I've put in the URL as secret as well because it's a public repo. The next step is the export solution. So again, you just use the same information from the secrets, and then you specify the solution name and where you want to export that solution. I'm doing both export managed and unmanaged. And then once I do both of the exports, then I basically use the unpack task. So this is taking the solution and then putting all the contents of that solution into this folder in a format that is compatible with version control. So again, this is the solutions folder that I showed you previously. And then once that is done, then there's another task which is actually creates a branch for me out of this folder. So it's not the master branch, so we'll create another developer branch for that, and I will show you that shortly. And this is where it's actually committing. So this is the sample and the solution, and it's committing the changes into there. So let's go back again into the action. Let's see if that action completed. So that action is still running. I think normally if you haven't used the environment for a while, I think the export tends to take very long. So I'm just going to basically run another one. So let's do that. Okay, so hopefully this one should be a lot quicker. Okay, so the idea is that this job once triggered, it will take the changes from my CDS environment and create a pull request. And then we have another job, which is basically taking the output of that and then creating the solution. So let's take a look at this file as well, just quickly. So I'm not going to go back through all the other things that we've already covered, but this one is very simple actually in this case. So all it's doing is then using the pack task. So again, it's using the Power Platform actions. So it's taking the changes from that folder in version control, and it's generating that zip, and then it's uploading it as an artifact. And I've already executed this process before, so you can see the execution. So you can see the solution zip gets uploaded into here, and you can see all the different steps that are getting executed. So this build is actually just using version control. You can see there is no connections. It's just packaging that solution from version control, and it's making it available for deployment. So you can have another step in this job now that then deploys it into the test environment, and then another one for the production environment, or any environment that is in the next stage. So let's go back into the actions. Any questions on the actions while this is executing? Okay. So you can see this is still executing. So I'll suggest we leave that running, and then we go back into some of the other changes, and then we come back to it in a little bit, and hopefully it will finish by then. So let's go back into the demo. So now I'm going to focus on some of the changes as well. So one of the APIs that's been used very frequently on a lot of projects, and I think the number of downloads that I've kind of gathered like a few weeks ago in terms of 44 million downloads, I think speaks for that. So this API, this library is deprecated, so it has lots of useful functionality. So if you are using this library, you probably want to think about starting to transition to one of the other, PowerShell modules that I'm going to be showing you shortly. So for example, we have the PowerApps admin commandlets. So these are the commandlets for the admins. So it allows you to manage your environments. There are some settings as well you can use on your Canvas apps, flows, and you can also do data prevention policies, so you can manage your DLP policies using that. And I think Geetha did a very good presentation earlier on the COE starter kit, which allows you to do some of that as well. But you can also use PowerShell to do that, to automate these as well. For example, if you reset an environment, you may want to reapply your policies. So the other one, the other module is for the makers. So this is for the team that is actually building the apps. So again, you got some capability to look at environments, but most of the commandlets are tailored towards the maker. So you can do things to the Canvas apps and flows, such as making changes to these in terms of adding things to the solution or managing permissions. So it's more tailored towards the makers. So these are probably one of the two important modules that you need to be aware of and use when you're working with the Power Platform, especially if you're automating some of these things either on the the developer machines or via pipelines or maybe some Azure jobs. So the other ones is the PowerApps checker. So there is lots of tasks for this, but if you have any very specific scenarios and you want to do checks in a very specific way, for example, excluding files, or you want to run, you want to do some post-processing on your checks that are different to what the tasks offer, then you can use that as well. And then finally, everything I showed today was kind of more tailored towards Azure DevOps and GitHub. But I know there is lots of projects out there that may be using some of the standard tools in their organizations, such as Jenkins or TeamCity. So if you are if you need to implement pipelines on these technologies, I think the previous modules that I've shared with you is a good starting point as well. But you also can utilize something like the XRM CI framework. So this is again an open source library. that contains lots of scripts that are built on some of the SDK modules and libraries that allow you to accelerate some of that work. So, for example, you can use it to import solutions, export solutions, and then some of the PowerApps scripts as well you can use, and that does your kind of so there's a script, for example, that allows you to check the output of the PowerApps checker and then fail the build. So you can use that if you're using Jenkins, for example. So it gives you just some additional lower level utilities that you can use either to kind of extend your Azure DevOps into to beyond what the tasks are doing, or to utilize the same kind of processes in different technologies. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about new features, but let's check if that build completed. Okay, we're not getting very lucky today, I think, with the solution. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, let's run another one. I think the export's not been very stable recently. Okay, let's leave that. Okay. So in terms of new features, so one of the things that you probably need to be aware of is the async solution export. So in the old days, there was one API to export the solution. So you call the export solution and it gives you a zip file. But a lot of us have seen issues recently with that in terms of timeouts. You export the solution, it doesn't work, or it times out, especially if you have proxies on the way, and you have a big solution which takes a little bit longer. So that tends to time out. So one of the things you can do now is there is a new way of exporting solutions, which is called the async export. So the Power Platform build tools and the Power DevOps tools support that. So the way this works is you call the export async, and you get two parameters back, which is the async operation and the export job ID. And then you call the async operation to see what's the status of that job. So once the async operation completes, then you call another API to download the solution using the export job ID. So it's a kind of at least 3-step process. But the benefits is that it's a lot more reliable and resilient, and you don't get the timeouts. So that's quite useful. Okay. So the other one is the environment variables. So this is now generally available. So if you're not using environment variables, it's a great way of separating your solutions from some of the configurations that need to be different per environment. So if you have a specific value that you need to use in a flow or in a model-driven app that changes per environment, it's a good way to even if it doesn't change per environment, instead of hard coding it, for example, in a plugin or JavaScript file, you could put it in an environment variable. And especially if it changes per environments, you could use that to do that separation, because what you can do is you can put the definition of the environment variable in the solution, but not the value. So that's the advantage here, is you can define all of these schema for the environment variables, and then it's up to you to decide whether you put the value in the solution or not. If you don't put the value, then you can set that value in the target environment, and it's quite powerful. So connection references, that's in preview. So previously, components in our solutions, such as, for example, a flow or an app, would have a direct dependency on a connection. So when you import that solution or that component to another environment, then you would have to change that component to repoint the connection, because most likely the connections will be different per environments. And that used to create an unmanaged layer, which then causes problems in terms of updating that component. So what we have now is we have something called the connection references. So the component links to a connection reference, which can be added to a solution, and that connection reference remains stable. So you can add these two to the solution, but the connection normally don't belong to the solution. So once you import the solution, you can change the connection reference to the connection in the target environment without actually making a change to the component. So that means any further updates to that components will work. So again, it's a very useful feature that gives you that separation between actual solution and the environment that you're deploying that solution into. So that kind of brings me on to the new solution import experience. So that's generally available now. And what that allows you to do is set your environment variables and connection references as part of the import. So you no longer have to do that separately or introduce these and manage layers. So this is how it looks like. So before you import the solution, you get prompted now. So if there is a connection or environment variable that doesn't have a value, it will the import experience will ask you for values for these. And if you import the solution or a newer version of that solution again, if the value is already there, you won't get prompted. So that gets preserved. So it's a good way of managing it. CDS instant admin mode, again, another update here. So basically, previously you could only set the admin mode on the sandbox instance. So you couldn't really do that directly on production instances. So that means you had to change the production instance into a sandbox, set the admin mode on and off, and then switch it back to production, and then you may lose some of the backups as a result of that. So that is no longer the case. So now you can directly set the admin mode on the production instance. It's a much simpler process now. And finally, I've covered a number of things today, but increasingly there's lots of things that are being shared on the ALM Docs. So it's a good resource to check out if you're just starting with DevOps on the Power Platform. There's lots of useful information there in terms of best practices, tools, and how you can get started. I'm going to give this thing a last try. Okay, timeouts are gone. Should have made it asynchronous. So this is the pull request is completed. So what I can do now is I can go in here and I say I want to create a new pull request, and it will tell me the branches that have been created. So this one has been created 4 minutes ago. So if I select that branch, so basically it's telling me that so this branch was generated by that build, and you can see it added that attribute into version control. So now once I commit that attribute into version control, we'll have all the latest changes from that CDS environment into version control. So I can create that pull request and then I can just merge that. So the idea of the pull request is that basically if you have multiple people working on the solution, you can create these pull requests, someone can review it in the team and then can merge it with the master, when it's ready. So once I merge it with the master, that means that the latest changes from the CDS environment would be available in version control. So basically what that is going to do again, it's going to kick off another action. This one has an automated trigger. Every time someone commits into version control, it just kicks off and starts packaging this solution and potentially importing it into another environment. So let's go back just into the presentation just to summarize. So as you can see, there's lots of new capabilities within the Power Platform that make it a lot easier and possible as well, because sometimes things were not possible, like with the connections. To do ALM and proper DevOps on the Power Platform, and I think more of these are likely to come in the future as well. There's lots of availability of tools. As you can see, there's lots of availability of kind of vendor tools like from Microsoft in terms of GitHub, Azure DevOps. There's lots of community tools as well that you can use. And there's lots of PowerShell modules as well in case you don't use any of these tools. Use some third-party, maybe CI/CD tools. So there's lots of PowerShell modules. One of the things I haven't mentioned is the Power Platform CLI. So it's got some capabilities to manage solutions. There's the XRM data PowerShell as well, which you can use to do similar things as well. So there's lots of things out there that you can use. New documentation as well, as I mentioned on the ALM Docs, and there's lots of people talking about this as well, and lots of blogs. So if you go into YouTube or Google, there's lots of different blogs and documentation in terms of how to get started. Some of the specific tools, deep dives, etc. So and all of that, I think, makes it easier to implement DevOps on your projects and utilize the benefits. So I've had this feedback slide. I'm not sure if it's if it's the most up-to-date one, but I'm open to questions now, if in case anyone has any questions.
Hi, Wael. I just had one question. This is Geeta here. You were just explaining about the ALM, right? I had a very peculiar question. So if at all you have multiple instances and you have multiple code base, right? And wherein you wanted to implement that core and localization kind of code base, when you wanted to maintain that, what is the best practice that you suggest?
So this is in case you want to develop, for example, two features that may have a different timelines, yeah?
Yeah, kind of two different features, but which has some something in common with the two features. So basically, you would have some percentage of the features which are in common between the two rollouts. Yeah, that's what I could
Okay. I think that's an interesting scenario. I don't think there's a magical solution. I think in general the best practice tends to be one. I think if you can avoid that scenario, I think you avoid the problems, I guess, that you may face. The other one is if you decide to kind of have two different environments working on two different features on two different features, is to break down the features in a way that minimizes the overlap between the two. If you end up with overlap, then I think the next best practice is to keep the features or the time to develop the features down to minimum. So make the features smaller so you don't end up with a huge overlap as a result of features being developed for a longer time. And if you can't avoid that, then I guess what you probably end up doing is having two separate branches and two separate environments, and then different people working in their own branch. So I think some of the things that may work is potentially if there is something that needs to be shared between the two, I think you could merge it as soon as possible. So if you do it in one environment and then the other team requires it, so for example, if you're working on the contact and then both of them need the contact, so if you make a change in one environment and that change is applicable and suitable to be merged into the other environment, you can merge it earlier rather than later, because the chances are people the change, it may be more difficult to merge later, I guess. The other thing I could recommend maybe is communication just between these two teams that are building these features, so they can agree between themselves in terms of when's the best time to make these changes that overlap, and where to do it and when. I mean, if you really wanted to go that far, you could have some tools that look at the environments and detect common changes and then flag it to people as well.
In this scenario, what I understand is that code standardization is not an easy job to achieve, right? That's what I figured out also, but just to discuss if at all you had different thoughts. Yeah. Thank you.
It's not easy, but I've seen it. I've seen lots of projects doing that and then successfully obviously deploying. It just adds a little bit of time and overhead in terms of the merge process.
Yeah.
And then, potentially some rework, depending on what components are being changed. Yeah.
Yeah.
But hopefully we'll see maybe some more optimizations in the solution structure to make these things a lot easier going forward.
Yeah, I'm awaiting that.
Yeah, me too. Any other questions?
And one more thing, so the feedback form and the QR code I have posted in the chat window. So this is not the latest one, sorry for that.
I'll take that off. Okay, anything else?
So guys, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and raise your questions.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, well, my name is Tammy. I have a questions based on your experience that you already have in the dynamic CRM, that one. I saw your configuration, that one, right? Actually, we actually put hard code all the solution that we want to export. So my question is how we actually need to manage our solution. Do you have any best practices for that one? Example, maybe we having one solution per feature, or maybe we grouping all the components, maybe metadata into one components, web resource into one component, something like that. Thank you.
So it sounds like your question is around how you organize solutions, and I think that there is probably different ways to do that, and I think I've probably went into some of these topics in different sessions. But at a high level, very quickly, I think there is two kind of things here. One of them is how you organize your solutions in terms of the dev of the solution, and then what you end up deploying and what you actually deploy to production may be different. So maybe you deploy one solution to production, but maybe in dev you have several solutions, or maybe you have several solutions in dev where you deploy several solutions to production. So I think first, I think these are probably two separate things. I think in terms of deploying solutions to productions, I think what probably works best is to have solutions around functionality. I'm not a big fan of splitting solutions based on web resources or plugins or things like that. I'd rather group them based on functionality, and you may end up with one or more solutions depending on how frequently you want to, for example, deploy these features, or what's the dependencies between the two, or who built these solutions. In terms of the dev environment, I wouldn't personally recommend having a solution per user story that you deploy to production, because you end up with too many layers. But in dev environment, I mean, there is probably nothing stopping you from having smaller solutions and then promoting these solutions to another environment once they are ready. And then you can decide what you take up from that environment into a test environment. Maybe you kind of merge these solutions once they're ready and tested. So there is different ways of doing that. I think it will largely depend on the team size, the complexity, how many functional areas do you have. But these are the kind of things I could think of at a high level now.
Yeah, because if you say that one means that we need to configure the action that one. If we have changes, we need to change the solution, is it? Solution name that one in the configuration, or it can be automatic or something.
Yeah, everything you can do automatic. I think there is lots of tasks. For example, in the Power DevOps tools, you have tasks to copy solution components. You have tasks to create solutions and export and patch. You have the PowerShell as well. You can use for more complex things. So most of the things can be automated. It's just deciding on the process and then automating that.
Okay, thank you. Well.
Okay. Anything else from anyone?
No.
One question.
Yes, sir.
How to make solution light? It means if we created solution 2 days before, and we added a lot of components, but just we change in some few. There is have some facility to remove the unchanged components from the solution.
I don't have a facility to remove the unchanged components from the solutions. What is your? Are you worried about the time it takes to import the solution, or?
No, sometimes we do not. We import some components, but it depends on other. But it is already in production. So when we ready solution, we want to make solution light to remove, because sometimes we install the extra some application which binds some relations with that entity. So we want to remove the extra. So just which we customized, we want that. So for that, to make solution light means to remove the components, we manually go and remove it. So there is have something to solution I created means 1 month before, but which components are added, extra components means before created and didn't modified. So there is have some to make solution light, just only include the changed components, which is after to added and inside that solution.
Okay, it's a complex question, I guess. Good question. I'll tell you a number of things that may help. Basically, so one of the best practices is, for example, solution segmentation. So I think previously, like, many months and years ago, you used to add the whole entity. And if you add the whole entity, especially an out-of-the-box entity, that causes you problems because it has dependencies on other entities which you may not need. So I think the first best practice is only add the things to the solutions that you customize. So if you just added one attribute, just add that attribute to the solution. For example, don't add the whole entity. If you made change to one view, just add that view.
Yes.
I mean, obviously for custom entities, it is slightly different because you have to add a certain number of mandatory things. So that's one thing, I think. The second one is in terms of promoting changes. I think patching is one way of promoting changes that, or of promoting light solutions that only have the changes that you've made. I think there is probably some optimizations as well that I think there is. I think in terms of the solutions themselves, I think the solutions are becoming more optimal as well. So I think you're expecting to probably see performances in terms of the ability to import the solutions. So you may not have to worry about whether you've got changes that were already there, because the import process is likely to be quicker as well. I know some other projects, for example, at some point used to look at version control, because if you're committing your changes into version control, you can actually see what files have been changed over time based on the Git commit history. But that's probably a step too far, in my opinion, because you're kind of working with the XML now, and this may not be supported in all the cases. So I would probably stick to solution segmentation, potentially look at patches, to be honest.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, looks like there's no more questions. So thanks everyone for your time. Hopefully you find it useful. Feel free to connect offline, and then if you have any specific queries, etc., I'll be happy to help you.
Thanks. It was an excellent session. Thanks for your time and thanks for your efforts. Thanks a lot for supporting the Microsoft Malaysia Business Applications User Group.
Thank you.
So before winding